And welcome back. We're going to go ahead and wrap our section on Boolean expressions by going ahead and talking about something known as a nested if. Now, what is a nested if? Well, nested if is another way for us to test compound expressions, but to also be able to add more functionality to our program. So, if you recall, we could use and or to test a compound expression. So, this is a great way for us to test, for example, let's say a number is both positive and it is less than 1,000. This is a great way for this because we could use, instead of trying to do some wonky coding, we can simply just use the and operator to test both conditions simultaneously. Again, valid way to test multiple conditions. We can do this with and, we can do this with or. Of course, and remember the big thing is both conditions have to be true, whereas with an or, both conditions are going to be true unless both conditions are false. So it's always going to evaluate, remember, or always evaluates to true unless they're both false, and always evaluates to false unless they're both true. But let's just say I wanted to do some other action based upon that second condition. So let's just say we wanted to test to see if a number is positive, and then we want to then test to see if it's like less than 0. Or maybe we have multiple conditions. Maybe we have 3 conditions we're testing. We want to act on that third condition. How do we set that up? Well, in this case, I will need to nest another condition branch within the first set of if statements. So let's look at what a nested if exactly is. So let's test to have a program output and change the value of a variable under 2 conditions. So we're going to look at this with an example. All right, let's just say our user-defined number needs to be less than 100 and should be positive. And we want that user-defined number to be even. Now, of course, we could do this with one long Boolean expression. However, we want to maybe do a little bit more with that. So if all of our conditions are true, we're going to set the variable's value to 15, and we're going to output. All right, cool. So we're doing more than one thing. You're having both a output statement here, so that means we're going to system out a print line, and we're setting a value, which means we're going to have an assignment statement in there. Otherwise, what we're going to do is simply just leave that value unchanged and output. Perfect. Let's look at this with some code. So when we look at this with an example here, obviously there's a couple different ways you can implement it, but this is just one way. So we say if num1 is less than 100 and num1 is greater than 0. That, of course, is meeting those conditions. We're saying that it's less than 100 and it is positive. Then we just simply are saying system out print line num1 is less than 100 and is positive, because that is meeting that first part of that condition. Then we said we had a second condition which we want to test, which was if it was even. So we say if num1 mod 2 equals 0. So this is that second condition. Notice this is inside the curly brackets for this big if statement here. So this is why it's called nested, because it's nested inside of that first branch. And then we just have a simple print line that says the number is even, because we're verifying that the number is even. And then we say num1 equals 15. System out that print line, change the number 15. And then, of course, we just exit that if statement now because this statement is done. So we're going to say system out of print line, printing the value again of num1, system out print line num1. Now, the thing to keep in mind when we start working with this is that you can nest any level. Nesting can be done as many levels as needed. You can nest ifs inside of ifs, inside of ifs, inside of more ifs, as many as your memory will pretty much allocate you to have. Now, obviously, this could get pretty complicated, pretty ridiculous, and you probably don't necessarily need that many because there might be a better approach that you could do that, but you can technically keep nesting. You can also nest inside of else ifs and else statements. So we, of course, our example just looked at doing this inside of an if statement, but we could take that same code and effectively put it inside of an else if statement, or we could put it inside of an else statement. You aren't just limited to using if either. Notice in our example, we had just a nested if, but you can fully branch using the appropriate if, else if, and else statements. So you could have a whole another set of conditionals inside of that. And you don't necessarily need to have, an if, an else if, and else on the topmost level. You can have just an if on the topmost level, and then inside your nested statement could have 15 different branches, for example, because maybe it only needs that first one to trigger. And then if it does, then it branches out to a bunch of different things. So for example, maybe you're going to look to see if it's a favorite number. And you're like, okay, the favorite number, it's going to say if this favorite number is between this range of values to see if it's valid. And then you're going to have maybe a nested if statement that's going to look for a list of names and see which person is corresponding to that random number. So that's just a way to kind of test that out. And here we are in Eclipse looking at our example, and you can see this is that same code that we saw before. And one of the things that we have here, you'll notice it says if num1 is less than 100, num1 is greater than 0. This is that first expression, and then we're going to evaluate it, and here is that nested if. And one thing you'll notice too, when we do a nested expression like this, is that it is indented inside here. So you'll notice that normally when we do an if statement, we indent our code to go inside this level here to indicate visually that this is part of this statement. But then when we do this if statement, you notice the keyword if and its curly bracket are now on the same level as the rest of this text. Whereas the stuff that's inside this if statement right here is indented over another line to visually indicate that it is inside of this code. And of course, if we run this code, all right, we get 36 is less than 100 is positive, the number is even, changing the number 15, printing the value again, num1, and we get 15. All right, awesome. Now, one thing I want to show real quick is, again, we can nest as much as we want. So for example, if I wanted to have an else statement here, and I want just to output that the number is odd, for example, I could easily add that in here, and it's not going to necessarily change how my program functions. All we're doing is we're just adding another piece of functionality, and we might say, you know, the number is odd. Let's just go ahead and set num1. Let's make it now to, let's say 12. And we can just system.out.println and add the appropriate text. So the number, or changing the number, so we can match the other one to 12. All right. And again, we could add other pieces in here. We could easily add more. We have, of course, just one if statement here, but I could easily come in here and add an else statement here and just say system.out.println. The number is not in the appropriate range. And then we could easily say like if, because we can, again, add a conditional here. We could say if num1, let's just say, was less than 100. Let's just say it's less than 100. All right. So we're still saying it's less than 100, but before we say it's less than 100 and is greater than 0. So maybe we want to now test to see if it is one of those other conditions. So let's just go ahead and make it an or here. So make sure it's greater than 0. And all I'm going to do for this one, I'm just going to add a quick system.out.println and just say one of the conditions is true. All right. Just to do a quick demonstration, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to go ahead and change this value here. So let's just go ahead and make this, let's say, a negative 36. Now that means it should bypass this whole if block here. All right. So if we do that, all right, we get the numbers not in the appropriate range. One of the conditions is true because it's bypassed that. Now this one, of course, we could say, well, we can just eliminate this. But what's if we wanted to do more with this? What's if from here with this if block, I wanted to do something else? What if I wanted to, for example, do some math here? So I only want that to happen if one of these conditions are true. And then, of course, I could have an else statement that where neither of those conditions are true. Now, of course, with the range of values that we have set up right now, with it being less than 100 and greater than 0, and it being an or statement, both of these statements are always going to trigger. So we're never really going to have an else. But we, of course, could easily add something in here to give this more value, give this more meaning. Because, right now, this else statement, I could put this in here, and, this function will, of course, work exactly the same. But if I leave that in there, what this is doing is that now I might be able to say, like, num1 plus or equals, how about plus equals? And let's just have it do that with 100. All right. What is that going to do? What is that going to change about that? Well, now, of course, it's going to take this negative 36 and add it to it. And then we could, of course, do more operations with it. Maybe we're changing. Maybe we could have it do something else with this value. So this is an advantage of having this if statement, even though, again, just one little print line like this, not really going to change that much. But when we start having other features and other functionality we want to add to our branches here, this is when these nested if statements are going to come in really handy and useful.